Some graves never let go of their secrets. I'm Director Chen, and I've been handling family relocations for Riverside Memorial for 23 years. Most exhumations are straightforward paperwork, permits, careful excavation, and transfer. Families move, old cemeteries close, or sometimes people just want their loved ones closer to home. Plot 47B was supposed to be routine. The Hendricks family was relocating their patriarch from our older section to the new family mausoleum. Standard procedure. Except nothing about that morning felt standard. The excavation crew arrived at dawn, and I supervised as they removed the granite marker and began digging. The soil came up easily, too easily for a grave that had been settled for 3 years. When we reached the burial vault, the concrete lid was askew, shifted about 6 inches to the left. That's not normal. Vault lids are heavy, precisely fitted, and sealed. They don't just move on their own. My crew exchanged glances, but I kept them focused. Sometimes settling causes shifts. Sometimes we lifted the concrete lid with the equipment, expecting to find the mahogany casket we'd placed there in 2020. Instead, we found empty space and a single piece of paper, folded neatly where Mr. Hendricks' body should have been. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. I walked home. That's when the first chill ran through me. I'd handled Mr. Hendricks' arrangements personally. Closed casket service due to the car accident. Family viewing the night before burial. Everything by the book. Bodies don't just disappear from sealed vaults 6 feet underground. I called the police immediately. But while we waited, something nagged at me. I remembered our security system had been upgraded recently, with cameras covering most of the grounds. Back at the office, I pulled up the footage from the past few months, scrolling through weeks of empty cemetery nights. 3 months ago, March 15th, at 3:07 a.m., the camera at the main gate caught something that made my hands shake as I watched. A figure in what looked like burial clothes, a dark suit, white shirt, walking steadily toward the exit. The gait was wrong, mechanical, like someone learning to walk again. The figure never looked up at the camera, never paused, just kept moving with that strange, measured step. I enhanced the image as much as our system allowed. The face was unclear, shadowed, but the build matched Mr. Hendricks' description. Same height, same slight stoop to the shoulders that his daughter had mentioned during arrangements. The suit looked like the charcoal gray we'd dressed him in. But here's what haunts me most. I checked our gate logs. No record of anyone leaving that night. No record of anyone entering either. The gates are locked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and they can only be opened from inside the security office. I was the only one with access that night, and I was home 30 minutes away. The police investigation turned up nothing useful. No signs of grave robbing, no disturbed earth around the plot until our excavation. The vault hadn't been broken into, it had been opened from the inside, though that's physically impossible for someone buried 3 years ago. The department's theory was body snatching, though they couldn't explain the missing concrete dust or the lack of tool marks. I started losing sleep, replaying that security footage. Frame by frame, I studied that figure, walking away from our cemetery in the middle of the night. The more I watched, the more details emerged. The way the left foot dragged slightly, Mr. Hendricks had suffered a leg injury in the accident. The particular angle of the head, his neck had been damaged, requiring additional support during preparation. Mrs. Hendricks came in a week later, for answers I couldn't provide. She sat across from my desk, hands folded in her lap, and asked me where her husband had gone. How do you tell someone their dead husband apparently got up and walked away? How do you explain something that violates every law of nature and 23 years of professional experience? Instead, I showed her the note. She stared at it for a long time, then looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "That's his handwriting," she whispered. "He always said he wanted to come home when he was ready." The family decided not to relocate the others to the mausoleum. They left the empty plot as is, with the original marker replaced. Sometimes I walk by plot 47B during my evening rounds, and I swear the earth looks different, softer somehow, like it's been disturbed from below. I never found out where Mr. Hendricks went after leaving through our gates. The security footage from that night ends at the property line. But sometimes, when I'm locking up late at night, I catch myself checking over my shoulder, wondering if I'll see another figure in burial clothes walking that same measured path toward whatever they call home. The note is still in my desk drawer. I tell myself I keep it as evidence, but really, it's a reminder that some things can't be explained by procedures and protocols. Sometimes the dead have their own plans. Dead faces aren't supposed to change, but Mrs. Kowalski kept smiling wider each night. I'm Rose, and I've been an embalmer at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home for 15 years. Night shift suits me, the quiet, the focus, the careful work of preparing people for their final goodbye. I take pride in my work, in making sure families remember their loved ones looking peaceful to dignified. That's why what happened with Mrs. Kowalski still keeps me awake some nights. Long after her service ended, she came to us on a Tuesday evening, an 82-year-old woman who'd passed peacefully in her sleep. Natural death, no trauma, just the gentle end that most people hope for. Her daughter brought in a navy blue dress and pearls, asked specifically for a subtle smile if possible. She always had such a lovely smile, she said. I'd like people to remember that. I worked on Mrs. Kowalski that first night with my usual care. The embalming process went smoothly, and I positioned her features naturally, just a slight upturn to the corners of the mouth. Nothing dramatic. The mortician's wax blended perfectly, creating the gentle expression her daughter had requested. When I finished, she looked serene, content, exactly how a grandmother should look in eternal rest. The viewing was scheduled for Thursday through Saturday, with the service on Sunday morning. Wednesday evening, I returned for my regular rounds, checking on the arrangements and making sure everything remained perfect for the family's viewing. I always do a final inspection, smoothing hair, adjusting makeup, ensuring the peaceful dignity remains intact. But when I entered the slumber room, something felt off. Mrs. Kowalski's smile looked different. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm family members, but enough to make me pause. The corners of her mouth had lifted slightly higher than I remembered setting them. I attributed it to the settling process. Sometimes facial features shift slightly as the tissues adjust. It happens. I made minor corrections and thought nothing more of it. Thursday morning, before the family viewing, I checked again. The smile was wider. Definitely wider than the night before. Wider than I'd ever set it. The upturn now reached almost to her cheekbones, creating an expression that was still technically a smile but felt somehow wrong. Too broad, too pleased, like she was enjoying a private joke. I spent an hour reworking her features, using additional wax and makeup to create a more natural expression. The family arrived at noon, and the viewing went well. They commented on how peaceful she looked, how much like the grandmother they remembered. Everything seemed normal. But that night, when I returned for evening maintenance, the smile had returned, wider than before, stretching almost unnaturally across her face. This was impossible. Bodies don't rearrange their own features. Rigor mortis had set in days ago. Her facial muscles should be completely fixed. Yet somehow, Mrs. Kowalski kept smiling bigger each time I checked on her. I documented everything, took photographs, measured the mouth width with calipers. Each night, the smile grew approximately 1/8 of an inch wider on each side. By Friday evening, her expression looked like she was caught in the middle of a delighted laugh, though no sound emerged and her body remained completely still. The strangest part was that no one else seemed to notice. Her daughter visited twice more. Other family members came and went, and everyone commented on how peaceful and happy she looked. When I mentioned to my supervisor that the expression seemed different, he glanced over and said she looked perfect, exactly what the family wanted. By Saturday night, the final evening before the service, Mrs. Kowalski's smile stretched from ear to ear. The expression was grotesque in its intensity, like someone had told her the funniest joke in existence and she couldn't stop grinning about it. I tried once more to adjust her features, but the wax wouldn't hold. Her face kept returning to that impossible, ecstatic smile. During the funeral service Sunday morning, I stood in the back of the chapel, watching the family say their goodbyes. Person after person approached the casket and commented on her beautiful smile and how happy she looked. The pastor mentioned her joyful expression in his eulogy, saying it was clear she had found peace. I was the only one who could see that the smile had grown so wide it was splitting at the corners, revealing teeth that seemed whiter and more numerous than they should be. The only one who noticed that her eyes, while still closed, somehow appeared to be crinkled with mirth. After the burial, I researched everything I could about post-mortem facial changes, decomposition, settling, muscle relaxation. None of it explained what I'd witnessed. I talked to other embalmers, described the progressive changes, but they all had logical explanations for what sounded like normal tissue adjustment. Maybe they were right. Maybe my mind played tricks on me during those long night shifts, creating patterns where none existed. Maybe the stress of the job was finally getting to me after 15 years. But I still have the photographs I took each night. And when I look at them in sequence, watching Mrs. Kowalski's smile grow wider and wider, until it becomes something that shouldn't exist on a human face, I know what I saw was real. I've since requested day shift assignments. Some mysteries are better left to the darkness. The flowers kept growing from where children shouldn't be buried. I'm Mills, groundskeeper at Oakwood Cemetery for 19 years now. I know every square foot of these 112 acres, where the soil drains poorly, which trees drop the most leaves, where the old graves settle and need attention. So, when I started finding fresh flowers on a plot that wasn't supposed to exist, I knew something was wrong. Plot 23C sits in the oldest section of Oakwood, where the record-keeping was spotty back in the 1800s. Most of the graves from that era have weathered headstones, with dates worn smooth by time and weather, but Plot 23C has never had a marker. According to our records, it's empty ground, never sold, never used. Just a grassy space between the Morrison family plot and the old Methodist section. The flowers started appearing in late spring, daffodils at first, then tulips, always fresh, always perfectly arranged in a small circle about 2 feet across. I assumed someone was confused about their family plot. Happens more often than you'd think. People remember different things. Emotions make geography fuzzy. I left the flowers alone, figuring whoever was leaving them would eventually realize their mistake. But the flowers kept coming. Every few days, a new arrangement appeared on the exact same spot. Always spring flowers. Always child-sized bouquets. Small teddy bears started joining them, along with colorful pinwheels that spun lazily in the morning breeze. Someone was definitely tending a grave there, treating that empty space like it held someone precious. After a month of this, I decided to investigate. I pulled out the old plot maps, cross-referenced them with the burial records, even dug through the Historical Society's archives downtown. Plot 23C showed up on every map as empty, unused, never sold to any family. But the more I researched, the more inconsistencies I found. The surrounding plots didn't quite line up right. The Morrison family plot was supposed to be adjacent to the Methodist section, but there was this gap exactly the size of one small grave between them, like someone had squeezed an extra burial into a space that wasn't supposed to be there. I started watching the area more closely during my daily rounds. The flowers never wilted, even during the hottest part of summer. The little teddy bears never showed weather damage, never faded in the sun. And the ground itself felt different under my feet, softer, more yielding, like soil that had been disturbed more recently than the century-old burials surrounding it. One morning in July, I found something that made me stop cold. The flowers had arranged themselves in a perfect circle, and inside that circle, the grass had grown in a pattern, not random like normal grass, but spelling out something. I had to kneel down and look carefully to make it out. Help me. That's when I decided to dig. I waited until after hours, brought my own shovel, and started carefully excavating Plot 23C. The ground gave way easily, too easily for earth that should have been undisturbed. About 3 feet down, my shovel struck something solid. Wood, old but not ancient. I brushed away the soil and found myself staring at the top of a small coffin, child-sized, made of simple pine. My hands were shaking as I cleared more dirt away. The coffin was maybe 4 feet long, 2 feet wide. Old-fashioned rope handles hung from the sides, and there was a small brass nameplate, green with age. I couldn't make out the inscription in the growing darkness, so I used my phone's flashlight to illuminate the metal surface. Emma Rose, age 6. Beloved daughter, 1887. The date sent a chill through me. 1887 was before our cemetery's official incorporation, before organized record-keeping. This little girl had been buried here when Oakwood was just farmland with a few scattered graves, buried by a family that probably intended to add proper markers later, but never got the chance. But as I brushed more soil away from the coffin lid, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Deep scratches in the wood, carved from the inside. Long, desperate gouges that could only have been made by fingernails, by someone trapped in darkness, clawing frantically at their wooden prison. The brass nameplate had more scratches around it, and when I looked closer, I could see they formed letters. The same message that had appeared in the grass above. Help me. I sat back on my heels, staring at that tiny coffin and those desperate scratch marks. Emma Rose, 6 years old in 1887, had been buried alive. Whether by mistake, by haste, or by some darker purpose, she'd woken up in her grave and tried to claw her way out. The flowers, the toys, the messages in the grass somehow. She was still trying to call for help. I couldn't bring myself to open the coffin that night. Instead, I carefully covered it back up, but not with the same finality as before. I left the soil loose, easy to move, and placed the fresh flowers back in their circle. The next morning, I contacted the Historical Society and started the process of getting Emma Rose a proper marker, a recognition that she had existed, that someone remembered her name. The flowers still appear on Plot 23C, but they're different now. Brighter, more vibrant, arranged with what looks like joy rather than desperation. The grass still grows in patterns sometimes, but now it spells out, "Thank you," in letters so delicate they look like they were written by tiny hands. I never did open that coffin. Some things are better left to rest, even if the rest took over a century to find. But every morning when I pass Emma Rose's plot, I see those flowers growing up through the earth, and I know she's not forgotten anymore. The dead have long memories, and sometimes all they want is for someone to remember their name. He sat in the back row for 3 days, wearing a dead man's suit. I'm Assistant Director Patel at Greenwood Funeral Home, and I've been helping families through their most difficult moments for 12 years. You learn to notice details in this business who needs extra support, which mourners might cause problems, how to read the subtle dynamics that grief brings out in families. But I'd never noticed someone who shouldn't have been there at all. Mrs. Chen's viewing was scheduled for 3 days, Thursday through Saturday, with the funeral service on Sunday morning. She'd been 94, passed peacefully surrounded by her children and grandchildren. The family was large, extended, with relatives flying in from across the country. The type of viewing where people flow in and out steadily, sharing memories, offering comfort, creating that gentle buzz of voices that helps healing begin. On Thursday afternoon, about an hour into the first viewing period, I noticed him, an elderly man, probably in his 80s, sitting alone in the back row of our largest chapel. He wore a well-tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, conservative striped tie, distinguished, quiet, the kind of mourner who preferred to pay respects from a distance rather than approach the family directly. I made a mental note of him because he sat so still, so perfectly composed, while others around him dabbed at tears or whispered consolations. His hands were folded in his lap, his gaze fixed steadily on Mrs. Chen's casket. Respectful, appropriate. But something about his absolute stillness made me glance his way more often than usual. When the evening viewing period ended at 8 p.m., he was still there. I approached him gently, the way we're trained to handle mourners who might need extra time to say goodbye. "Sir, we're closing the chapel for this evening, but you're welcome to return tomorrow." He looked up at me with clear, bright eyes, nodded once, and stood smoothly. No words, just a polite acknowledgement, and he walked out with that same measured dignity. I watched him leave, noting how straight he held himself, how carefully he moved. Old school manners, the kind you don't see as often anymore. Friday morning, he was there when I opened the chapel at 10 a.m. Same seat, same position, same unwavering attention focused on the casket. Throughout the day, as family members and friends came and went, he remained constant. I started paying closer attention to the guest book, trying to figure out who he was, but his name never appeared on any page. By Friday evening, I was curious enough to approach Mrs. Chen's daughter Linda, who was coordinating with the family. "There's been a gentleman attending all the viewings," I said. "Elderly, navy suit, sits in the back. I'm wondering if he might need any special assistance or if you know his connection to your mother." Linda looked confused. "I don't know anyone matching that description. Can you point him out?" I turned toward his usual seat, but the back row was empty. He'd left again without me noticing, despite my attention to the chapel throughout the evening. Linda and I went through the guest book together, page by page. Plenty of signatures from family, friends, neighbors, her mother's church community. But no one who matched the quiet man in the navy suit. Saturday brought the largest crowd, as weekend viewings often do. Extended family, old friends, people who couldn't make it during weekday hours. The chapel was full, voices creating a warm murmur of shared memories and gentle laughter. And there he was again, back row, same seat when possible, or standing respectfully when the row filled up. I decided to watch him more carefully. For 3 hours that afternoon, I found excuses to position myself where I could observe him directly. He never moved except to stand when someone needed his seat. He never spoke to anyone, never approached the casket, never signed the guest book. Other mourners seemed to look right through him, as if he wasn't there at all. That's when the detail that had been nagging at me finally clicked into place. The suit. I'd seen that exact navy suit before, that specific shade and cut. I'd helped Mrs. Chen's family select it 5 years ago, when we'd handled the funeral for her husband, Robert Chen. I pulled Robert Chen's file from our records, flipped to the clothing inventory we always document for families. Navy blue suit, white dress shirt, burgundy striped tie. The tie was different, but everything else matched perfectly. The man in the back row was wearing a dead man's clothes. My hands were shaking as I looked through the photo documentation we'd taken for the family standard practice for our own records and insurance purposes. There was Robert Chen in his casket, wearing that exact suit. And there in the photos of his viewing 5 years ago, I could see the same man in the background of several shots, sitting in a different chapel, but maintaining that same respectful distance. He'd been attending his own wife's viewing. Saturday evening, as we prepared to close the chapel for the final time, I approached him again. This time, I looked directly into those clear, bright eyes and said, "Mr. Chen? Robert Chen?" He turned his full attention to me, and for a moment, his expression held such profound sadness that I nearly stepped back. Then he smiled, the gentlest, most grateful smile I'd ever seen, nodded once more, and stood to leave. "She was a good wife," he said quietly, the first and only words I ever heard him speak. 67 years. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, he was gone. The funeral service Sunday morning proceeded beautifully. The family found comfort in sharing memories, in celebrating a life well lived. I stood at the back of the chapel during the service, scanning the crowd, But the quiet man in the navy suit never appeared again. Later, when I helped Linda and her siblings sort through the personal effects we'd removed before burial, she held up an old photograph. Her parents, on their wedding day, 1956. Robert Chen, young and handsome in a navy suit that would last him through decades and beyond. I never told the family about their father's attendance at the viewing. Some gifts are too precious to analyze, too perfect to question. Love that transcends death doesn't need explanation, just quiet recognition. But I still check the back rows during viewings, looking for faces that belong to other times, other goodbyes. Because if love can bring someone back for 3 days to sit quietly with their beloved one last time, then this job means more than I ever imagined. The refrigeration unit only malfunctioned around her, and the frost spelled out words. I'm Webb, and I've been a mortician at Valley View Funeral Home for 21 years. In that time, I've learned to expect the unexpected equipment failures at the worst possible moments, bodies that present unique challenges, families with complicated dynamics. But I'd never had refrigeration problems that seemed tied to one specific person, problems that defied every repair attempt and left messages in ice. Sarah Martinez came to us on a Tuesday morning in October. 28 years old, mother of 2 young children, killed instantly when her car hit a patch of black ice on Route 73. The police said she never had a chance. The car spun into oncoming traffic at 40 miles per hour. No suffering, they told her husband. Quick and merciful. The family wanted a viewing, which meant I needed to prepare her despite the significant trauma. Car accident cases are never easy, requiring careful reconstruction work, but Sarah's injuries were manageable. I'd handled far worse in my career. What I couldn't handle was what happened when I placed her in refrigeration unit number 3. Our facility has 6 refrigeration units, each maintaining a constant 36 degrees Fahrenheit. They're medical-grade units, reliable, with backup systems and temperature monitoring. Unit 3 had been installed just 2 years earlier, still under warranty, never given me a moment's trouble, until Sarah Martinez. The temperature alarm went off at 2 a.m. Wednesday morning, 12 hours after I'd placed her body in storage. When I arrived at the funeral home, Unit 3 was reading negative 15 degrees cold enough to freeze solid anything inside. The other 5 units were functioning normally, maintaining their proper temperatures, but Unit 3 had somehow turned itself into a deep freeze overnight. I called our repair service immediately, but when the technician arrived, Unit 3 was back to normal temperature. No error codes, no signs of malfunction, all systems functioning perfectly. He ran complete diagnostics and found nothing wrong. Must have been a sensor glitch, he said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Thursday morning, the same thing happened. Negative 12 degrees this time, and when I opened the unit to check on Sarah's condition, I found frost patterns covering the interior walls. Not random ice formation, but delicate, deliberate shapes that looked almost like writing. The letters were faint, formed by condensation and freezing, but I could make out what looked like cold, written in script across the back wall. The repair technician returned, more puzzled than before. Again, by the time he arrived, everything was functioning normally. He replaced the temperature sensor, updated the software, checked all the electrical connections. Should be good as new, he promised, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Friday morning brought another alarm, and this time the temperature had dropped to negative 22. The frost patterns were more elaborate now, covering not just the walls but forming delicate traceries across the ceiling of the unit. When I looked closely, I could make out words, "So cold," and underneath, in smaller letters, "Help warm." That's when I noticed something else. The other 5 units, all functioning normally according to their displays, had developed a thin layer of frost around their door seals. Not enough to trigger alarms, but visible if you knew where to look. Whatever was affecting Unit 3 was spreading, like a cold that wanted to reach beyond its boundaries. I moved Sarah to Unit 5, hoping the problem was specific to the hardware. Within 6 hours, Unit 5's temperature had plummeted to -18, and the frost writing appeared again, more urgent this time. Still cold, and children need mommy warm. The repair company sent their senior technician, a man with 30 years of experience who'd never encountered anything like this. He installed completely new temperature control systems in both affected units, replaced the refrigeration coils, even checked our electrical supply for anomalies. Everything tested perfect, but he looked troubled as he packed up his tools. "I've seen equipment act strange," he told me, "but never like this. It's almost like something's fighting the temperature controls, trying to make it colder. You might want to consider moving your inventory to another facility until we figure this out." But I couldn't do that to Sarah's family. The viewing was scheduled for Saturday and Sunday, with the funeral Monday morning. Moving her would mean delays, complications, additional trauma for people already devastated by loss. I decided to monitor the situation personally, staying overnight to observe what was happening. Saturday night, I set up a camp chair in the preparation room, where I could watch all 6 refrigeration units. At 11:30 p.m., Unit 5's temperature display began dropping. I watched the numbers fall: 36, 34, 30, 20, 10, 0, -5. The frost began forming immediately, delicate patterns spreading across the interior surfaces like living lace. But this time, I could see more than just words. The frost was forming images, crude but recognizable figures, 2 small shapes that looked like children, reaching upward toward a larger figure that must have been Sarah. Above them, in letters now clearly legible, the message had changed. "Too cold for children. Need mommy warm hugs." I understood then. Sarah Martinez had died on a patch of ice, killed by cold that came without warning. Now she was trapped in artificial cold, separated from the warmth of life, from the children who needed their mother's embrace. The temperature problems weren't mechanical failures. They were a mother's desperate attempt to break free from the cold that had taken everything from her. I made a decision that violated every protocol I'd learned in 21 years of mortuary work. I turned off the refrigeration in Unit 5 and wheeled Sarah to the preparation room, where I could maintain her condition through other means until the viewing began in the morning. The temperature alarm stopped immediately. The other units returned to normal function. And on the viewing room table, where Sarah lay in peaceful rest, surrounded by flowers and photographs of her children, the air stayed naturally, gently warm. Her husband and children had their chance to say goodbye in comfort, to hold her hands one last time, without the shock of cold that reminded them how she died. The funeral proceeded beautifully, and Sarah Martinez was laid to rest on a warm October afternoon under golden autumn sun. Unit 5 has functioned perfectly ever since. But sometimes, during the coldest winter nights, I still check the temperature displays and remember a mother who fought artificial cold with the desperate need to be warm for her children one last time. Love doesn't end with death. Sometimes it just needs better conditions to express itself. GPS doesn't account for where the dead want to go. I'm Luis, and I've been driving transport for memorial services for 8 years. It's steady work, picking up bodies from hospitals, nursing homes, accident scenes, delivering them to funeral homes across 3 counties. I know every road, every shortcut, every traffic pattern between here and the state line. So when my GPS took me somewhere I'd never been, somewhere that shouldn't have existed, I knew something was wrong. The call came in Tuesday afternoon. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, 87 years old, passed away at St. Mary's Hospital after a brief illness. Standard transport to Riverside Funeral Home, about 45 minutes across town on roads I could drive blindfolded. Her granddaughter met me at the hospital to sign the paperwork and follow the hearse to make arrangements. I loaded Mrs. Vasquez carefully, secured everything according to protocol, and started the familiar route. The granddaughter, Maria, was following in her sedan about 50 feet behind. Traffic was light, weather clear. Nothing unusual about the afternoon, except for a nagging feeling that I was forgetting something important. 20 minutes into the drive, my GPS started acting strange. The route display flickered, showing turns I wasn't supposed to make, directing me away from the main highway onto secondary roads I rarely used. I ignored it at first. Technology glitches happen, and I knew the way to Riverside without electronic help. But the voice prompts became more insistent, and the screen kept flashing recalculating every few seconds. Then the hearse started pulling to the right, subtle but persistent, like the alignment was off or I had a slow tire leak. I checked the dashboard, no warning lights, everything normal, but the vehicle kept wanting to turn onto County Road 12, a winding two-lane that led away from town toward the older residential areas. I fought the steering for another mile, but the pull became stronger, almost impossible to resist. Behind me, I could see Maria's sedan following dutifully, probably wondering why I was taking such an indirect route. Finally, I gave in and turned onto County Road 12, telling myself I'd find a place to stop and check the vehicle. The road wound through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, past houses that looked older than they should have, architecture that seemed out of place for this part of the county. Victorian homes with wraparound porches, craftsman bungalows with deep eaves, all maintained beautifully but somehow timeless, as if they'd been frozen at the moment of their construction. My GPS went completely dark for about 10 minutes. No signal, no directions, just a blank screen, while the hearse continued following the road's curves without any input from me. I kept my hands on the wheel, but I wasn't really steering. The vehicle knew where it wanted to go. We crested a small hill, and I found myself looking down at a house that made me catch my breath. Two-story colonial, white with green shutters, a garden full of roses that were somehow blooming despite the October chill. An elderly man sat on the front porch in a rocking chair, and as the hearse approached, he stood and walked down to the front gate. I pulled into the driveway without meaning to, my foot pressing the brake without conscious decision. The engine shut off on its own. In my rearview mirror, I saw Maria's car stop at the curb, her face confused but patient through the windshield. The elderly man approached my window, moving with the careful steps of someone in their 80s, but with purpose, with anticipation. He was well dressed in slacks and a cardigan sweater, his white hair neatly combed. His eyes were bright, alert, and somehow familiar. "Is that Eleanor?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent that matched Mrs. Vasquez's last name. I found myself nodding. "Yes, sir, but I think I'm lost. I'm supposed to be delivering her to Riverside Funeral Home." His face lit up with such joy that I felt tears prick at my eyes. "She's come home," he said. "I've been waiting for her to come home." Behind him, the front door of the house opened, and a middle-aged woman stepped out onto the porch. Then another woman, younger, and a man in his 30s. They all had the same features, the same warm eyes, the same sense of familiarity that I couldn't place. "Mama's here," the elderly man called to them, and they hurried down from the porch, gathering around the hearse with expressions of welcome and love that I'd never seen at a body pickup before. That's when I realized what was happening. This was Eleanor's family, not the living family that Maria represented, but the family that had gone before. The husband who'd died 5 years earlier, the son lost to cancer, the daughter who'd passed in a car accident, the grandson who'd never made it past 25. They were all there, waiting on the porch of what must have been Eleanor's childhood home, the place where she'd grown up before marriage and moves, and the long journey that all lives take away from their starting points. I sat in the driver's seat, not knowing what to do or say. This wasn't in any training manual, wasn't covered by any company policy. But the family, both the living granddaughter behind me and the deceased relatives surrounding the hearse, seemed to understand each other in ways that transcended my confusion. The elderly man, who must have been Eleanor's husband, placed his hand gently on the hearse's window. "Thank you for bringing her home," he said. "She always said she wanted to come home when she was ready." I blinked, and suddenly, I was sitting on County Road 12 with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The GPS was working normally, showing the correct route to Riverside Funeral Home. Behind me, Maria's car sat at a respectful distance. No sign that anything unusual had happened. But Mrs. Vasquez felt different now. Lighter, somehow. More at peace. The nagging feeling I'd had all afternoon was gone, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that I couldn't explain. When we arrived at Riverside, Maria came inside to complete the arrangements. As she signed the papers, she mentioned that her grandmother had grown up in an old neighborhood on the other side of town, in a white house with green shutters where she'd been happiest. She always said she wanted to go home one more time, Maria told the funeral director, just to see the roses her mother planted. I didn't tell them about the detour, about the family waiting on the porch, about the roses that were somehow blooming in October. Some journeys are too private to share, too perfect to question. But now, when I make deliveries, I pay closer attention to when the GPS glitches, when the vehicle wants to go somewhere other than my planned destination. Because sometimes the dead know exactly where they need to go, and they just need someone to drive them there. The living aren't the only ones who get to go home. Some plots hold more than their records show. I'm Kay, cemetery supervisor at Restland Memorial for 16 years. I know every grave, every plot boundary, every inch of drainage and soil composition across our 150 acres. When you're responsible for the final resting place of 8,000 souls, you develop an intimate relationship with the land itself. So when Plot 18F showed signs of previous use during what should have been a first burial, I knew our records were wrong. The Henderson family had purchased the plot 3 months earlier, a prime location in our newer section with mature oak trees and good drainage. Standard pre-need arrangement. Mr. Pro Henderson was 91, in hospice care, wanting to spare his family the stress of making decisions during grief. Everything routine, everything properly documented. When Mr. Henderson passed the following Tuesday, we began preparing Plot 18F for burial. I always supervise new grave excavations personally, checking depth, ensuring proper alignment, making sure everything meets both state regulations and our facility's standards. The excavation crew arrived at dawn, and I expected a straightforward dig in earth that had never been disturbed. But when they broke ground, the soil came up wrong. Too loose, too dark, with the layered composition that indicates previous excavation. After 40 years in cemetery work, I know the difference between virgin earth and soil that's been moved before. Plot 18F had definitely been dug previously, despite showing as unused in every record I could access. I had the crew stop work immediately and pulled the plot files again. 18F, purchased March 15, 2023 by the Henderson family. No previous sales, no transfers, no recorded burials. The plot maps showed it as empty space between the established Johnson family section and the newer Memorial Garden. But the earth told a different story. We dug carefully, treating this as a potential archaeological situation. 3 feet down, my suspicions were confirmed when the crew's shovels struck something solid. Wood, old but not ancient. We cleared the soil away slowly, revealing the top of a casket that wasn't supposed to be there. The coffin was simple pine construction, probably mid-20th century based on the hardware and joinery. No nameplate, no identification markers, just plain wood that had aged to a silvery gray. Most concerning was the condition. The lid was slightly askew, as if the seal had been broken from within. I called our main office immediately, but while we waited for the lawyers and administrators, I decided to document everything thoroughly. The casket was oriented properly, suggesting an official burial rather than some kind of illegal disposal. Someone had been laid to rest in Plot 18F with all the proper formalities, but somehow the paperwork had been lost or never properly recorded. When the administrative team arrived, They brought the oldest plot maps they could find, dating back to Restland's founding in 1962. 18F showed as empty on every map, but the adjacent plots told an interesting story. What was now 18F appeared to be a gap, a space that should have been part of the Johnson family plot, but was somehow separated from it. The decision was made to open the unknown casket for identification purposes. I've witnessed hundreds of exhumations in my career, but I'd never opened a coffin that wasn't supposed to exist. The lid lifted easily, wood screws having loosened over the decades, and inside, we found something that made everyone present take a step back. The casket contained not a body, but a mirror. A full-length mirror, custom cut to fit the coffin's dimensions, placed where a body should have been. The glass was old, silvered with age spots and darkening around the edges, but still reflective enough to show our faces as we peered down into the grave. But the reflections were wrong. Instead of showing the 5 people standing around the excavation site, the mirror reflected 7 figures. 2 additional faces appeared among us. A middle-aged woman in what looked like 1960s clothing, and an elderly man in a suit that seemed even older. Both looked directly up at us with expressions of profound sadness, as if they'd been waiting decades for someone to finally find them. One of the administrators stepped back from the grave, visibly shaken. "This is some kind of mistake," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. We all saw the same thing, reflections of people who weren't there. Faces that belonged to another time looking up at us from impossible depths. I ordered the site secured immediately, covering the grave with tarps and posting security. The Henderson family was notified about the delay, told there were administrative complications that would require a few days to resolve. We couldn't very well explain that their father's burial site was occupied by a mirror full of dead people. Research into the cemetery's early records revealed fragments of the truth. In 1968, there had been a recording error involving several plots in that section. 2 burials had been processed incorrectly, their records lost in a fire that destroyed part of the administrative office. The Restland board at the time had decided to mark those plots as unusable, rather than deal with the complications of unidentified remains. But instead of properly marking plot 18F as occupied, they'd apparently buried the problem literally. The mirror in the coffin wasn't random placement. It was a memorial, a reflection of loss that couldn't be properly documented. The 2 faces we saw were the unrecorded dead, people whose names had been lost but whose presence remained. We relocated Mr. Henderson's burial to plot 18G, directly adjacent to the original site. The family understood there had been administrative complications and accepted the change gracefully. Plot 18F was officially redesignated as a memorial space, permanently reserved for the unknown residents who'd been waiting 55 years for recognition. I still visit the site regularly during my rounds, though we left the mirror in place and sealed the grave permanently. Sometimes, especially in the late afternoon when the light hits just right, I see more than just my own reflection in that silvered glass. The faces change, sometimes showing the original 2, sometimes revealing others, all the people who might have been lost in bureaucratic errors, filing mistakes, or deliberate oversights. Cemetery records are meant to be permanent, but memory is more enduring than paperwork. Some graves hold secrets that won't stay buried, reflections of lives that refuse to be forgotten just because their names disappeared from official documents. The dead keep their own records, written in mirrors and memories that last longer than paper. She appeared in every photo, but no one remembered her at the service. I'm Jim, funeral coordinator at Peaceful Valley Memorial, and I've been helping families document their final goodbyes for 14 years. Photography at services is delicate work, capturing meaningful moments without intruding, preserving memories while respecting grief's privacy. I take pride in creating images that comfort rather than disturb. But after Mr. Rodriguez's service, I learned that cameras sometimes capture more than what the living eye can see. Manuel Rodriguez was 93, a beloved patriarch who'd built a successful construction business and raised 6 children who became pillars of their community. His funeral was large, over 200 attendees, filling our main chapel, with extended family, business associates, and friends spanning 3 generations. The kind of service where photography becomes crucial because not everyone can fit in the front rows, and distant relatives want to share in the ceremony even from the back of the room. I shot discreetly throughout the service, using available light to avoid flash disruption. The usual angles: the casket, surrounded by flowers, family members embracing, the pastor delivering his eulogy, the congregation singing hymns that Mr. Rodriguez had loved. Everything standard, everything respectful, everything designed to help the family remember how well loved their father had been. When I downloaded the images that evening for editing, I noticed her immediately. In the back corner of nearly every wide shot, there stood a woman I didn't remember seeing during the service. Elderly, perhaps in her 70s, wearing a dark blue dress that looked vintage, not outdated, but classic in a way that suggested quality and care. She held herself with quiet dignity, hands folded, attention focused completely on the casket. At first, I assumed she was a distant relative. I simply hadn't noticed. Large funerals create crowds where individual faces blur together, and my attention during shooting is usually focused on lighting and composition rather than identifying specific attendees. But as I edited each image, her presence became more notable. She appeared in 17 different photographs taken over the course of the 2-hour service. Always in the same general area, always with the same respectful posture, but her position subtly shifted, as if she'd been moving closer to the casket throughout the ceremony. In the earliest photos, she stood near the back wall. By the final images, she was positioned directly behind the casket, close enough to reach out and touch the flowers. What struck me as unusual was her expression. While everyone else in the photos showed the typical range of funeral emotions: grief, comfort, reflection, gentle conversation, her face held an intensity that seemed deeper, more personal. She looked at Manuel Rodriguez's casket the way a wife might look at her husband's grave, with love and loss so profound it transcended the public nature of the gathering. I called the family the next day to deliver the edited photos, and mentioned the woman in blue, thinking they might want extra prints for her. Rosa, Mr. Rodriguez's eldest daughter, was confused. "I don't remember anyone in a blue dress," she said. "Can you describe her more specifically?" I pulled up one of the clearest images on my computer. Elderly woman, probably mid-70s, silver hair, in a neat bun, wearing what looks like a navy blue dress with a small brooch. She's standing behind the casket in most of the later photos. There was silence on the phone for several moments. When Rosa spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. "Can you email me that photo? I'd like to show it to my siblings." An hour later, Rosa called back, and this time she wasn't alone. I could hear other family members discussing something in the background, voices mixing excitement with confusion. "Jim," she said, "we think we know who that is, but it's impossible. The woman in the photo looks exactly like our father's first wife, Carmen. But Carmen died 20 years ago. We buried her in 1998. The background conversation grew more animated. Someone was saying, "It's definitely her," while another voice insisted, "It can't be possible." Rosa continued, "Carmen and Dad were married for 37 years before she passed. They were incredibly devoted to each other. He never remarried, said no one could replace her. We always hoped, they'd be together again someday." I stared at the photo on my screen, at the woman whose love for Manuel Rodriguez was so evident it seemed to radiate from her expression. "Would you like me to print larger copies of these photos?" "Yes," Rosa said immediately. "All of them, especially the ones where she's closest to Dad." When I delivered the prints the following day, the entire Rodriguez family was gathered at Rosa's house. They showed me old family photos, wedding pictures from 1961, anniversary celebrations, Christmas gatherings, dozens of images of Manuel and Carmen Rodriguez throughout their decades together. The resemblance was unmistakable. The woman in my funeral photos was Carmen Rodriguez, exactly as she'd looked in her 70s, wearing the same style of dress she'd favored, holding herself with the same quiet grace that characterized her in family portraits. But Carmen Rodriguez had been cremated 20 years earlier. Her ashes were interred in the memorial garden at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, where she and Manuel had been married. There was no body to produce, no physical form that could have stood in our chapel during her husband's funeral service. The family decided to keep the photos, but asked me not to share them publicly. Some things are too precious to explain, Rosa told me. If Mama found a way to be there for Dad's goodbye, that's between them and God. I agreed, but the experience changed how I approach funeral photography. Now I pay closer attention to faces in the background, to figures that seem to stand apart from the gathered mourners. I've started taking more wide-angle shots, capturing the entire gathering rather than focusing only on immediate family. In the year since Mr. Rodriguez's service, I've noticed similar anomalies in 3 other funeral photo sets. Figures that families don't recognize but that seem intimately connected to the deceased. People dressed in clothing from different eras, standing with the kind of attention that suggests profound personal connection. I don't mention these observations to families unless they ask. Most people have enough to process without wondering about impossible attendees at their loved one's funeral. But I've learned that cameras are democratic instruments. They record what's present, not what living eyes choose to see. Love transcends physical presence. Sometimes it just needs a photographer to document the proof. The humming came from the chapel, but Mrs. Park had been dead for 3 days. I'm Dale, night watchman at Heritage Funeral Home, and I've been walking these quiet halls for 11 years. Night shift in a funeral home teaches you to appreciate silence, to find comfort in the absolute stillness that comes after families go home, and the business of grief gives way to peaceful rest. But some nights, the silence gets interrupted by sounds that shouldn't exist, and you learn the difference between settling wood and something more inexplicable. Mrs. Park arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 91 years old, passed peacefully at Golden Years Nursing Home. Her daughter mentioned during arrangements that her mother had been a music teacher for 40 years, known throughout the community for her gentle voice and the lullabies she'd sung to calm anxious children. She hummed constantly. Her daughter smiled through tears. Even in her sleep, she was always humming something beautiful. Friday and Saturday passed normally during my rounds. The viewing was scheduled for Sunday and Monday, with the funeral service Tuesday morning. Mrs. Park rested peacefully in our smallest chapel, surrounded by flowers and photographs, showing a life dedicated to music education. Everything typical, everything serene. Sunday night, around 11:30 during my first security round, I heard it. Soft humming coming from the chapel, melodic and gentle, the kind of sound that might drift from a mother's bedroom as she helped a child fall asleep. I assumed it was the building's ventilation system, creating harmonics. Old buildings develop their own acoustic personalities, and heritage dates back to 1953. But as I approached the chapel, the humming became clearer, more distinctly human, a woman's voice, carrying a simple melody with the kind of natural rhythm that comes from years of soothing children. I stopped outside the chapel door, listening carefully, trying to identify the source. The humming was coming from inside the chapel, specifically from the area where Mrs. Park's casket was positioned. This made no sense. The chapel had been empty when I'd secured the building at closing time. No family members remained, no staff were scheduled to work overnight, yet someone was definitely humming inside that room. I opened the chapel door slowly, expecting to find a family member who'd somehow stayed behind or gained access after hours. Instead, I found Mrs. Park sitting upright in her casket, head turned slightly toward the doorway, humming a lullaby I recognized from my own childhood. Her body was positioned exactly as I'd last seen her during the afternoon, set up, hands folded, dressed in the blue dress her daughter had selected, hair styled perfectly by our beautician. But she was sitting up, and she was singing. My first thought was that rigor mortis had somehow caused the body to shift position, creating an illusion of movement. But rigor mortis doesn't make bodies sit up, and it definitely doesn't make them hum lullabies. Mrs. Park was genuinely, impossibly upright, her voice clear and beautiful as she worked through what sounded like Brahms' lullaby in a language I couldn't identify. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching this elegant elderly woman sing to an empty chapel with the same gentle attention she'd probably given to thousands of children over 4 decades of teaching. Her eyes remained closed, her expression peaceful, but her head moved slightly as she shaped each note, her breathing visible in the subtle rise and fall of her chest. The rational part of my mind insisted this was some kind of hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and imagination. But Mrs. Park's voice was too clear, too real, too beautifully modulated to be anything but genuine singing. She finished Brahms' lullaby and moved seamlessly into another melody, this one unfamiliar but equally soothing. I retreated to the security office and checked the building's cameras. But our surveillance system doesn't cover the interior of the chapels, privacy concerns for families during viewings. I had no way to record or verify what I was witnessing, only my own eyes and ears as evidence. For the next hour, I listened from the hallway, as Mrs. Park worked through what seemed like an extensive repertoire of lullabies and children's songs. Some I recognized, others sounded international, as if she was sharing music from various cultures she'd encountered during her teaching career. Her voice never wavered, never showed fatigue, maintaining the clear, gentle tone of someone who had spent her life making music accessible to young minds. Around 1 a.m., the singing stopped abruptly. When I entered the chapel again, Mrs. Park was lying in her original position, hands folded, eyes closed, looking exactly as she had when the evening viewing ended. No signs of movement, no indication that anything unusual had occurred. If not for the lingering sense of melody in the air, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the entire experience. Monday morning, I mentioned the incident to our funeral director, describing it as possible settling sounds from the building's structure. He nodded absently, focused on the day's arrangements, but I noticed him listening more carefully during his own walkthroughs. Monday evening brought the final viewing, and Mrs. Park's daughter spent considerable time at the casket, speaking quietly to her mother about childhood memories and shared musical experiences. As the family prepared to leave, her daughter turned to me and said, "I hope Mama's been peaceful here. She never could sleep without humming a little." That night, during my 11:30 round, I heard the humming again. This time, I didn't investigate directly. Instead, I sat in the hallway outside the chapel and listened as Mrs. Park sang her way through another evening of lullabies, her voice carrying all the warmth and comfort she'd offered children throughout her long career. The humming continued until dawn, stopping only when the morning staff arrived for funeral preparations. Mrs. Park's service proceeded beautifully, filled with music and memories of a woman who had enriched countless lives through song. I never heard her voice again after the funeral, but during quiet nights, when the building settles and creates its own soft sounds, I sometimes think I catch echoes of those lullabies. Music has a way of lingering in spaces where it's been loved, and Mrs. Park had clearly loved making music wherever she found herself. Some people carry their gifts with them beyond death, sharing what they did best one final time before moving on to whatever stage awaits. For a music teacher who spent her life soothing children with gentle songs, humming lullabies through her own transition seems like the most natural thing in the world. Peace sometimes comes with its own soundtrack. His phone kept calling from 6 feet underground. "I'm Morgan, funeral director at Sunset Memorial, and I've handled every kind of family request in my 18 years here." People want to bury loved ones with meaningful possessions, wedding rings, photographs, favorite books, sometimes even cell phones, so they feel connected across the divide of death. Usually, these items rest peacefully with the deceased, offering comfort to families who need to know their loved one has familiar objects nearby. But Thomas Brennan's phone wouldn't stay quiet, and neither would he. Mr. Brennan was 68, a retired electrician who died suddenly of a heart attack while working in his garden. His wife of 42 years, Margaret, was devastated by the unexpected loss. During our arrangement conference, she clutched his cell phone like a lifeline, scrolling through their text conversations from just hours before his death. "He was always calling me," she told me through tears. "Every morning when he went to the hardware store, every afternoon when he finished his projects, sometimes just to tell me he loved me. I can't bear the thought of his phone being disconnected, of losing that last connection to him." I understood completely. Many families struggle with canceling their loved one's phone service. It feels like severing the final thread that binds them to ordinary life. Margaret asked if we could bury the phone with Thomas, and I assured her that personal electronics were commonly included with burial items. The wake and funeral proceeded normally. Thomas was laid to rest on a beautiful Thursday afternoon in October, his phone tucked into the inner pocket of his favorite jacket. Margaret found some peace in knowing he had it with him, along with their wedding photo and a letter she'd written during the long night after his death. 3 days later, Margaret called our office in distress. She was receiving voicemails from Thomas's number, not old messages she'd saved, but new recordings made after the burial. The first message was brief, just static, and what sounded like muffled breathing. But each subsequent call became clearer, more urgent. I assumed there was some kind of technical explanation. Cell phones sometimes maintain partial connections, even when service has been suspended, and signal echoes can create strange effects. I arranged to visit Margaret that evening to help her understand what was likely happening. When I arrived at her house, she played the most recent voicemail for me. Thomas's voice, unmistakably his, came through her phone's speaker. "Margaret, I'm not ready yet. Don't let them disconnect the phone. I'm not ready to let go." The message was clear, coherent, and absolutely impossible. Thomas Brennan had been buried 3 days earlier with a phone that had no active service. Yet somehow, he was calling his wife from his grave, leaving messages that grew more desperate with each passing day. Margaret showed me the call log on her phone. Every message came from Thomas's number, all placed between 2 and 4 a.m., all lasting exactly 37 seconds. The phone company confirmed that his service had been canceled the day after the funeral, and that no calls could originate from that device. But the calls kept coming. Night after night, Thomas's voice grew more frantic. "I'm trapped, Margaret. I can see the phone, but I can't reach it. Help me reach the phone. Then, the darkness is so complete. I need to hear your voice. Why don't you answer when I call?" Margaret was sleeping poorly, jumping every time her phone rang, torn between desperately wanting to hear her husband's voice and being terrified by the impossibility of his calls. She asked me to arrange an exhumation, to check on Thomas's condition, and perhaps retrieve the phone that was somehow causing him distress. Exhumations require court orders, family consent, and significant justification. I'd never requested one based on posthumous phone calls, but Margaret's distress was genuine, and something about Thomas's increasingly urgent messages suggested more than technical malfunction. The procedure took place on a gray morning, 2 weeks after the burial. Margaret waited in the funeral home while I supervised the careful excavation of Thomas's grave. When we opened the casket, we found everything exactly as we'd left it, except for the phone. Thomas's body showed no signs of movement or disturbance, but his jacket pocket was open, and the phone lay on his chest, screen cracked but somehow still glowing with battery power that should have died days earlier. More unsettling, the phone showed dozens of outgoing calls in its log, all to Margaret's number, all made from inside a sealed casket 6 feet underground. I had the phone examined by an electronics specialist, who confirmed it was physically impossible for the device to maintain network connectivity from that depth and location. The cracked screen displayed the same message repeatedly. Call Margaret. Tell her I love her. Not ready to say goodbye. Rather than leave the phone with Thomas, I made the decision to remove it and present it to Margaret, along with an explanation of what we'd found. She listened to my account with surprising calm, then asked to hold the phone one final time. As she cradled it in her hands, it rang. Not her phone, Thomas's phone, the one that should have been dead and disconnected. She answered without hesitation. Hello, my love. Thomas's voice came through clearly. I just wanted to tell you I'm ready now. The phone helped me find my way to you one last time, but I don't need it anymore. I love you, Margaret. I'll be waiting. The line went dead, and the phone's screen went black permanently. No amount of charging or technical manipulation could revive it. Margaret kept Thomas's phone in the drawer of his bedside table, but it never rang again. She told me later that the desperate edge had left her grief, replaced by a certainty that their connection transcended physical devices and earthly limitations. I've since included questions about electronic devices in my arrangement consultations, helping families understand that sometimes the objects we bury with our loved ones serve purposes we never intended. Technology might fail, but love finds ways to bridge any gap, even the distance between life and death. Some calls are too important to let technical limitations interfere with their delivery. The casket kept returning to where it belonged, no matter how many times we moved it. I'm Torres, Exhumation Specialist for Heritage Cemetery Services, and I've relocated over 300 graves in my 12 years of work. Cemetery relocations are complex operations. Entire sections sometimes need to be moved for development projects, highway expansions, or facility upgrades. It's meticulous work requiring respect, precision, and careful documentation. But I'd never encountered a grave that refused to stay relocated, that somehow found its way back to its original resting place night after night, like a homing pigeon made of mahogany and brass. Willowbrook Cemetery was closing after 87 years of operation. Its grounds needed for a new medical complex. The city contracted us to relocate 432 graves to Westland Memorial, a process that would take 6 weeks of careful excavation, transport, and reinterment. Standard procedure, though emotionally challenging for families watching their loved ones' final homes being disturbed. Plot 73 in the old section held Edmund Walsh, buried in 1947 according to cemetery records. No living relatives had claimed responsibility for the relocation, making him one of 37 graves that would be moved at city expense to a designated section at Westland. Just another routine transfer in what should have been a straightforward project. The excavation went normally. Mr. Walsh's grave showed typical settling for a burial of that age, and his casket was in good condition despite being underground for 76 years. Solid construction, brass fittings that had held up well, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see much anymore. We loaded him carefully into our transport vehicle and delivered him to Westland, where he was assigned Plot 147 in the relocated section. Tuesday morning, I arrived at Westland to oversee the reinterment process, but Plot 147 was empty. The grave we dug the previous afternoon showed no signs of disturbance, but Edmund Walsh's casket was simply gone. No tire tracks, no equipment marks, no indication that anyone had been in the area overnight. My first assumption was theft, though casket stealing is virtually unheard of in the industry. I called Westland's security office, but their overnight guard reported nothing unusual. No unauthorized vehicles, no suspicious activity, no sounds that might indicate excavation work. While reviewing the situation with Westland's supervisor, one of my crew members called from Willowbrook. "You need to get over here," he said, his voice tight with confusion. Plot 73. I drove back to the original cemetery expecting to find evidence of vandalism or some kind of prank. Instead, I found Edmund Walsh's casket sitting in his original gravesite, positioned exactly as we'd found it the day before. The excavation hole we'd left behind had been perfectly filled, the earth settled as if it had never been disturbed. This was impossible. Moving a casket requires heavy equipment, multiple workers, hours of careful digging and placement. Someone would have had to excavate the filled grave, transport the casket across town, and reinter it with precision that matched our professional standards, all without anyone at either location noticing. I documented everything with photographs and measurements, then called for a crew to relocate Mr. Walsh again. This time, I arranged for security cameras at both locations and had Restland's night watchmen specifically monitor plot 147. Wednesday afternoon, we moved Edmund Walsh for the second time. Same careful procedure, same attention to detail, same assignment to plot 147 at Restland. I personally supervised the reinterment, ensuring the casket was properly positioned and the grave completely filled. Thursday morning, plot 147 was empty again. The security cameras showed nothing unusual, normal nighttime cemetery scenes with no human activity or vehicle movement. But somehow, Edmund Walsh had returned to plot 73 at Willowbrook, his grave restored to its original condition. This time, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The path between the two cemeteries showed a faint trail of disturbed earth, as if something heavy had been dragged along the 4-mile route between facilities. The trail was barely visible, just a slight depression in grass and soil, but it led directly from Restland to Willowbrook, following the exact route our transport vehicles used. I moved Mr. Walsh a third time, but now I was paying attention to details I'd missed before. The casket felt different during handling, not lighter or heavier, but somehow more resistant to movement, as if it preferred to stay where it was. The brass nameplate, which I'd cleaned during the first move, had developed a patina overnight that suggested decades of weathering. Friday morning brought the same result. Empty grave at Restland, occupied grave at Willowbrook, with that faint trail of disturbed earth marking the impossible journey. But this time, I found something else. Fresh flowers on plot 73. Roses that hadn't been there the previous afternoon, arranged in a pattern that spelled out home in neat cursive letters. No one had visited Willowbrook since we'd begun the relocation process. The cemetery was officially closed, with no public access and security preventing unauthorized entry. Yet someone, or something, was not only moving Edmund Walsh's casket, but decorating his grave with floral messages. I researched Mr. Walsh's history, hoping to understand why his remains seemed so attached to their original location. Edmund Walsh, born 1898, died 1947, had been a groundskeeper at Willowbrook Cemetery for 28 years. He'd maintained those grounds, walked those paths, tended every grave in that old section, with the dedication of someone who considered the cemetery his true home. The city's relocation contract included provisions for unusual circumstances, but nothing covered graves that moved themselves. After consulting with supervisors, lawyers, and even a psychologist who specialized in death-related phenomena, we made an unprecedented decision. Edmund Walsh would stay at Willowbrook. We negotiated an exception with the development company, setting aside plot 73 and a small surrounding area as a memorial garden. The medical complex was redesigned to incorporate this space, creating a quiet courtyard where Edmund Walsh could continue his eternal rest in the place he'd spent his life protecting. The flowers still appear regularly on his grave, arranged in different patterns that seem to express gratitude. The trail of disturbed earth never appeared again after we made the decision to let him stay. Sometimes, during my work at other cemeteries, I think about Edmund Walsh and wonder how many other graves hold people who have their own ideas about where they belong. Home isn't always a place you choose. Sometimes it's a place that chooses you, that calls you back no matter how far you travel or how many people try to convince you to stay elsewhere. Edmund Walsh spent his life caring for Willowbrook Cemetery, and in death, He made it clear that the cemetery would care for him in return. Some relocations aren't meant to succeed. Some people know exactly where they belong, and they have the determination to make sure that's where they stay. Mr. Sullivan's eyes kept opening during preparation, but he'd been blind for 30 years. I'm Jackson, and I've been an embalmer at Peaceful Memories Funeral Home for 19 years. The work requires steady hands, careful attention to detail, and respect for the dignity of death. I take pride in preparing people so their families remember them looking peaceful, natural, ready for whatever comes next. But sometimes the dead have their own ideas about how they should appear, and Mr. Sullivan's case taught me that blindness doesn't always end with death. Robert Sullivan came to us on a Wednesday morning, 83 years old, passed away peacefully at Sunset Manor after a long battle with diabetes complications. The family mentioned during arrangements that he'd lost his sight completely 30 years earlier, but had adapted remarkably well, learning to navigate his world through touch, sound, and the devoted assistance of his daughter Carol. He always said losing his sight taught him to see things that really mattered. Carol told me as we reviewed the preparation details: family, kindness, the sound of voices he loved. He claimed blindness was a different kind of vision, not a limitation. The embalming process began routinely. Mr. Sullivan's body showed the typical effects of advanced diabetes: poor circulation, skin fragility, the careful handling required for elderly remains. But when I positioned his head and began working on facial features, I noticed his eyes kept opening. This isn't entirely unusual. Sometimes the muscles that control eyelids don't respond properly to the positioning compounds we use, requiring additional attention to maintain natural appearance. I used standard techniques to keep his eyes closed: small amounts of medical adhesive, cotton packing, careful positioning that would look peaceful for family viewing. But every time I turned away to work on other aspects of the preparation, Mr. Sullivan's eyes would open again. Not the random muscle movement that sometimes affects fresh remains, but deliberate, focused opening, as if he was trying to see something specific. The third time this happened, I noticed something unsettling. His eyes, when open, seemed to track movement around the preparation room. They followed my movements from the supply cabinet to the embalming table, focused on doorways when I walked through them, even appeared to watch my hands as I worked. This was medically impossible. Mr. Sullivan's medical records clearly documented complete blindness resulting from diabetic retinopathy. The damage to his retinas had been irreversible, total, confirmed by multiple specialists over 3 decades. There was no physical mechanism by which his eyes could track anything, especially not hours after death. I called my supervisor, thinking there might be some technical explanation for the apparent eye movement. He observed the body for several minutes, but saw nothing unusual to him. Mr. Sullivan appeared completely peaceful, eyes closed, showing no signs of the restless behavior I'd described. But when my supervisor left the room, Mr. Sullivan's eyes opened immediately and fixed directly on mine. Not the unfocused stare of death, but the attentive gaze of someone trying to communicate something important. His eyes were clear, alert, and unmistakably aware of my presence. I found myself talking to him, which violated every professional protocol I'd learned. "Mr. Sullivan, is there something you need to see? Something you're looking for?" His eyes moved deliberately toward the door, then back to my face, then toward the door again. The message was clear. He wanted me to look at something, or someone, who was coming through that doorway. Thursday afternoon, during the first viewing, I positioned myself where I could observe Mr. Sullivan's casket without being obvious. The family had chosen an open casket service, and his appearance was exactly what I'd hoped for: peaceful, dignified, eyes properly closed. But I was watching for something else. Carol approached the casket around 3 p.m., leaning down to speak quietly to her father. The moment she began talking, I saw Mr. Sullivan's eyelids flutter slightly, though not enough for anyone else to notice. His daughter spoke about missing their daily conversations, about decisions she was facing without his guidance, about how much his wisdom still meant to her. As she spoke, his eyes opened just enough to create the suggestion of awareness, of listening. Carol didn't seem to notice, but I could see him focusing on her voice with the same intense attention he'd shown me in the preparation room. That evening, after the viewing ended, I returned to check on the setup for the next day. Mr. Sullivan's eyes were open again, but this time they were fixed on a specific spot near the chapel entrance. I followed his gaze and saw Carol sitting alone in the back row, looking through a box of photographs and letters. "You're watching over her, aren't you?" I said quietly, making sure she's okay. His eyes moved back to mine and, I swear, showed what looked like gratitude before slowly closing. Friday brought similar observations. Throughout the viewing hours, Mr. Sullivan's eyes would open whenever Carol was present, tracking her movements around the chapel, focusing on her conversations with other mourners. When she stepped outside for air, his gaze would shift to the doorway until she returned. The funeral service Saturday morning was beautiful, filled with stories about Mr. Sullivan's kindness, his adaptation to blindness, his dedication to family. During Carol's eulogy, I watched his face carefully and saw his eyes open just enough to focus on her as she spoke about the lessons he'd taught her about seeing with the heart. After the service, as we prepared for the procession to the cemetery, Carol approached me privately. "This might sound strange," she said, "but I felt like Dad was watching me these past few days. Not in a frightening way, just present. Like he was making sure I was going to be okay." I told her that wasn't strange at all, that many families report similar feelings during the grieving process. But privately, I wondered if some connections between parent and child transcend the physical limitations of life and death. If love can restore sight to eyes that had been dark for decades. Mr. Sullivan was buried on a sunny Saturday afternoon, his eyes finally remaining closed throughout the committal service. But Carol's composure, her strength during the ceremony, suggested she'd received whatever assurance she needed from their final conversations. I've since paid closer attention to the families of my cases, watching for signs of continued connection between the living and the dead. The preparation room has taught me that death doesn't always sever the bonds that matter most, and sometimes those bonds can overcome physical limitations that seemed permanent in life. Sight comes in many forms. Sometimes the most important kind of vision has nothing to do with eyes that work, and everything to do with hearts that refuse to stop watching over the people they love. She came every evening to see her grandfather, but security cameras showed me talking to empty air. I'm Lynn, mortuary assistant at Garden of Peace Funeral Home, and I've been helping families through their most difficult transitions for 7 years. Evening shifts suit me. The quiet allows for careful attention to details, and families often need extra support during those first raw hours after loss. But I'd never encountered a mourner who existed only for me, who visited her grandfather faithfully despite having died herself 15 years earlier. Mr. Charles Hoffman arrived on a Monday evening, 89 years old, passed away at home, surrounded by family after a brief illness. His arrangements were handled by his son David, who spoke lovingly about his father's role as family patriarch and his special relationship with his granddaughter Rebecca, who had tragically died in a car accident as a teenager. "Dad never got over losing Becca," David told me during our consultation. "She was his shadow from the time she could walk. Even after she died, he'd set a place for her at family dinners, save her favorite cookies at Christmas. We worried about him sometimes, but he said she still visited him, that death couldn't break the bond they shared." Tuesday evening, around 7 p.m., I was arranging flowers in the viewing room when I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. A young girl appeared in the doorway, maybe 14 or 15 years old, with long dark hair and wearing a blue dress that looked like something from the early 2000s. She moved with the quiet respect appropriate for a funeral home, approaching Mr. Hoffman's casket with obvious familiarity. "Hello, Grandpa," she said softly, settling into the chair beside the casket. "I've been waiting for you to come here, so we could visit properly. David's been taking good care of arrangements, but I wanted some time just for us." I assumed she was a great-granddaughter or young relative I hadn't met during the arrangement conference. Families are complex, and not everyone can attend every meeting. I continued my work quietly, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a private moment between grandfather and granddaughter. For the next hour, she spoke to Mr. Hoffman with the easy conversation of someone continuing a long relationship. She updated him on family news, school activities, friends he would have remembered from when she was alive. Her voice carried the natural cadence of a teenager, full of enthusiasm and the assumption that her grandfather was listening to every word. "The viewing starts tomorrow," she told him. "David did a good job picking your blue suit, the one from Becca's graduation. I know you can't see it, but you look very handsome. Everyone's going to remember how distinguished you always looked for special occasions." Around 8 p.m., she stood and kissed her grandfather's forehead gently. "I'll come back tomorrow evening. Try to rest, and don't worry about David and Mom. They're sad now, but they'll be okay. I'll make sure you get to see them all one more time before we go." She walked past me with a polite nod and disappeared into the hallway. I followed a moment later to lock up behind her, but the corridor was empty and the front door remained locked from the inside. She'd simply vanished. Wednesday evening brought the first family viewing, and I watched carefully for the girl in the blue dress. The extended family was large, with several teenagers among the mourners, but none matched the young woman I'd spoken with the night before. When I asked David about relatives who might visit during off hours, he looked confused. "All the family's accounted for," he said. "And Rebecca, well, she's been gone for 15 years, though Dad always claimed she still visited him. We found this photo in his wallet. He carried it everywhere." The photograph showed Mr. Hoffman with a teenage girl who looked exactly like my evening visitor, down to the blue dress and long dark hair. But according to the date written on the back, the photo had been taken in 2008, just months before Rebecca's fatal accident. That evening, after the viewing ended and families had gone home, Rebecca returned. Same blue dress, same quiet approach to her grandfather's casket, same natural conversation that assumed his complete attention. "The viewing went well," she reported, settling into her usual chair. "David held up better than I thought he would, and Aunt Margaret finally stopped crying long enough to tell that story about the fishing trip. You would have loved hearing all those memories." I decided to approach her directly. "Excuse me," I said gently. "I'm Lynn, the mortuary assistant here. I don't think we've been introduced." She looked up with bright, intelligent eyes and smiled. "Oh, hello. I'm Rebecca, Mr. Hoffman's granddaughter. Thank you for taking such good care of him. This is exactly how he would have wanted everything arranged." "Rebecca?" I said carefully. "Your father mentioned you passed away some time ago." Her expression grew thoughtful but not distressed. "Yes, 15 years now. Car accident, very sudden. But Grandpa and I always had a special connection. Distance doesn't matter much when you love someone, and neither does time." We talked for another hour, and Rebecca was absolutely real to me, solid, present, engaging in conversation, with the natural ease of someone comfortable in her own existence. She shared memories of time spent with her grandfather, expressed gratitude for the care he'd received, and showed genuine concern for how the family was handling their loss. But when I reviewed the security footage the next morning, I saw something that made me question my own sanity. The cameras showed me moving around the viewing room alone, arranging flowers, adjusting chairs. There was no sign of Rebecca anywhere in the footage, but clearly visible were my interactions with empty air, me speaking to an unoccupied chair, nodding at responses from no one, carefully moving around space where Rebecca had been sitting. Thursday and Friday evenings followed the same pattern. Rebecca would arrive around 7 p.m., visit with her grandfather for an hour or two, then disappear before I could determine how she was entering or leaving the building. Each night, the security cameras recorded only my side of our conversations. But to me, she was as real and present as any living person. Saturday morning, the day of the funeral, Rebecca didn't appear during her usual evening hours. Instead, she came during the service itself, though I was the only one who could see her. She stood at the back of the chapel throughout the ceremony, smiling peacefully as family members shared memories of Mr. Hoffman's long life. During the committal service at the cemetery, I saw her once more, standing beside the grave as her grandfather was laid to rest. When the final prayer was completed and the family began to leave, Rebecca approached me for the last time. "Thank you for letting me visit with him," she said. "It meant everything to have that time together before we moved on. He's ready now, and so am I." "Where will you go?" I asked. Her smile was radiant. "Wherever grandfathers and granddaughters get to be together forever. He's been waiting 15 years to see me again, and I've been waiting just as long to show him it's not scary on this side." She walked toward the grave, where I could just make out the transparent figure of Mr. Hoffman waiting for her, looking young and healthy and whole. They embraced, and both figures faded into the afternoon sunlight. I never saw Rebecca again, but I learned something profound about the bonds between grandparents and grandchildren. Love that's strong doesn't recognize the boundaries between life and death. Sometimes it just needs a quiet place and understanding witnesses to complete connections that were interrupted by tragedy. The security cameras may have shown me talking to empty air, but my heart knew better. Some visitors are too precious to appear on surveillance footage, too important to be limited by the ordinary rules of existence. The grass spelled out dates from 50 years in the future, and the plot belonged to someone still alive. I'm Frank, head groundskeeper at Eternal Rest Cemetery, and I've been maintaining these 90 acres for 24 years. I know every grave, every tree, every patch of ground that needs special attention. Grass grows according to predictable patterns: moisture, sunlight, soil composition, foot traffic. But Plot 12D started growing words that shouldn't exist, dates that haven't happened yet, messages from a future that terrified me to contemplate. Plot 12D sits in our newer section, purchased in 2015 by Harold Chen, a healthy 42-year-old accountant who wanted to make advance arrangements after his father's death. Pre-need planning is common, responsible, the kind of forward thinking we encourage. Mr. Chen selected a nice spot under a young maple tree, made full payment, and received documentation showing the plot would be available whenever needed. Standard transaction. Nothing unusual about the paperwork or the location. The first strange grass pattern appeared in early spring, about 6 weeks after the ground thawed. Instead of growing evenly like the surrounding plots, the grass over 12D formed distinct shapes, numbers that looked intentional, deliberate, as if someone had carefully seeded specific areas to create a message. Initially, I thought it might be vandalism or some kind of prank. Teenagers sometimes think cemetery mischief is funny, and selective herbicide application could create patterns in grass growth. But the numbers were too precise, too carefully formed to be random damage. The pattern spelled out a date: 3/17/2071, March 17th, 2071. A date 47 years in the future, appearing in grass that grew over an unused burial plot. I took photographs and made notes in my groundskeeping log, planning to monitor the situation over the following weeks. By summer, the pattern had changed. The grass now spelled 11/22/2071, again in numbers precise enough to be clearly legible from standing height. November 22nd, 2071. A different future date, appearing in vegetation that should have been growing randomly. I researched everything I could about unusual grass growth patterns: fungal infections, chemical contamination, underground utility lines. root systems from nearby trees. Nothing explained how grass could organize itself into readable numbers, especially numbers that referenced dates, decades in the future. Fall brought another change. 2/8/2072, February 8, 2072. Each new pattern appeared gradually over several weeks, as if the grass was slowly rearranging itself into new configurations. I started checking Plot 12D daily, documenting each change with photographs and measurements. What disturbed me most was the precision of the dates. These weren't random number combinations that I was interpreting as dates. They followed proper month, day, year formatting, appeared in sequence chronologically, and changed at regular intervals as if following some kind of schedule. During winter, when the grass went dormant, I investigated the soil composition of Plot 12D. Core samples showed normal earth, proper drainage, no chemical anomalies that might affect plant growth. The underground area contained no utilities, no root intrusions, no physical factors that could influence surface vegetation. But while examining the plot records, I discovered something that made my hands shake as I read through the documentation. Harold Chen, the plot owner, had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. His medical records, which he'd included with his pre-arrangement updates, showed a progressive condition that typically resulted in death within 10 to 15 years of diagnosis. The first date that appeared in the grass, March 17, 2071, would be exactly 56 years from Harold's birth date. The subsequent dates followed at 3 to 4 month intervals, as if marking the progression of someone whose time was measured in months rather than years. Spring brought new growth and a new date, 6/14/2072, but this time, something else appeared alongside the numbers. Words, formed in slightly different grass that grew darker and taller than the surrounding area. Harold Chen, followed by not ready yet. I contacted Harold Chen immediately, asking if I could visit to discuss his pre-arrangements. What I found was a man in his early 60s who looked much older, showing the cognitive decline and physical deterioration that characterized advanced Alzheimer's disease. His daughter Susan was managing his affairs, making decisions about care facilities and medical treatment. "Dad's been having episodes," Susan told me during our conversation. "Sometimes he thinks he's still 42. Sometimes he doesn't recognize family members. But occasionally, he has these moments of complete clarity where he talks about seeing dates in his dreams, numbers that frighten him." She showed me Harold's journals from his lucid periods, page after page of dates written in his careful handwriting, dates that matched exactly the patterns appearing in Plot 12D's grass. March 17, 2071, November 22, 2071, February 8, 2072, June 14, 2072. He writes these down and then tells me their messages about when he's supposed to die. Susan said, "The doctors say it's part of the disease process that some patients become fixated on death-related anxieties. But the dates are so specific, so consistent." I didn't tell her about the grass patterns. How could I explain that her father's unused grave was growing the same dates he was recording in his journals? How do you tell someone that the earth itself seemed to be counting down to a death that was still decades away? Over the following months, I watched Plot 12D continue its impossible calendar of future dates. Each new pattern appeared exactly when Harold Chen recorded matching dates in his journals, as if his mind and his eventual resting place were somehow synchronized across time. The final pattern appeared in late fall, 10/31/2074, followed by Harold Chen and Ready Now. 3 days later, Susan called to tell me her father had passed away peacefully in his sleep. October 31st, 2024, exactly 50 years before the date that had appeared in his grave's grass. Harold Chen was buried in Plot 12D on a cold November morning. The grass over his grave now grows normally, evenly, showing no unusual patterns or messages. But I keep detailed records of every date that appeared, every message that grew from earth that somehow knew its future occupant's schedule better than medical science could predict. Some people are connected to their final resting place long before they arrive there. Harold Chen's plot spent years preparing for his arrival, marking time in a way that transcended present reality. The grass grew dates from a future it could see but couldn't prevent, counting down to a moment that was always approaching, always certain. Time moves differently for the dying. Sometimes it moves differently for the places that wait to receive them, too. Mrs. Kim whispered warnings about dangers her daughter hadn't shared with anyone. I'm Director Sullivan at Riverside Funeral Home, and I've been guiding families through loss for 22 years. The work teaches you to expect. The unexpected grief expresses itself in countless ways, and the recently deceased sometimes seem to hold on to life with a tenacity that defies medical explanation. But I'd never heard a dead woman speak prophecy, sharing secrets about her daughter's life that no living person could have known. Grace Kim arrived on a Tuesday morning, 74 years old, passed away suddenly from a stroke while preparing dinner for her daughter's visit. The family described her as devoted, protective, the kind of mother who worried constantly about her children's safety and happiness. Her daughter Jennifer was devastated by the unexpected loss, especially since they'd been planning to discuss Jennifer's recent engagement over the meal that never happened. The preparation process began routinely. Mrs. Kim had suffered minimal physical trauma from the stroke, requiring only standard embalming and cosmetic restoration. But during the positioning phase, as I worked to create a peaceful expression for viewing, I heard something that made me stop completely. Mrs. Kim whispered her daughter's name. This wasn't the random vocalization that sometimes occurs during preparation, escaping gases, settling tissues, the mechanical sounds that inexperienced staff sometimes mistake for supernatural activity. This was clear, deliberate speech. Jennifer. Spoken with the urgent tone of someone trying to get attention. I paused my work, listening carefully, but heard nothing more. Auditory hallucinations aren't uncommon in high-stress professions, and I'd been working longer hours than usual. I attributed the voice to fatigue and continued with the preparation. An hour later, Mrs. Kim spoke again. Jennifer, be careful. Michael is not what he seems. The company money, the trips to Chicago, ask about the missing accounts. This time, there was no mistaking what I'd heard. Mrs. Kim was speaking clearly, coherently, providing specific information about people and situations I'd never heard mentioned during family arrangements. Jennifer had mentioned her fiancé Michael briefly, but there had been no discussion of his work or any concerns about his character. I documented the incident in my preparation notes, though I wasn't sure how to categorize what I'd witnessed. Bodies don't speak hours after death, especially not to provide detailed warnings about living people's relationships. Yet I'd heard Mrs. Kim's voice as clearly as if she were sitting up and speaking directly to me. Wednesday evening, during the first viewing, I positioned myself where I could observe both Mrs. Kim's casket and her daughter Jennifer. The family receiving line was long. Mrs. Kim had been beloved in her community, but I paid particular attention to Jennifer's interactions with her fiancé Michael. Michael appeared to be everything a grieving daughter could want in a support partner. Attentive, respectful, handling logistics so Jennifer could focus on receiving condolences. But I found myself studying him more carefully than I would normally observe family members, looking for signs of the deception Mrs. Kim had mentioned. That night, after the viewing ended, Mrs. Kim spoke again, while I performed routine maintenance on the viewing room setup. The credit cards in Jennifer's name, the loan against her house. She doesn't know about the gambling debts. Tell her to check the accounts before Saturday. I was alone in the building. No one else to witness what I was hearing. No way to verify or explain the impossible conversation. Mrs. Kim's voice carried the desperate urgency of a mother who discovered her daughter was in danger, but couldn't warn her through normal channels. Thursday morning, I made a decision that violated every professional boundary I'd maintained in 22 years of funeral service. I called Jennifer and asked if I could speak with her privately about something her mother had mentioned before her death. Jennifer met me at the funeral home Thursday afternoon, curious but not alarmed. I'd rehearsed several ways to approach the conversation, but settled on direct honesty tempered with sensitivity. "This may sound unusual," I began, "but your mother seemed very concerned about your relationship with Michael. Specifically, about financial matters, company money, trips to Chicago, accounts that might need checking." Jennifer's expression changed immediately from polite attention to sharp focus. "She never mentioned anything like that to me. How could she know about, wait, what exactly did she say?" I shared the details Mrs. Kim had provided, watching Jennifer's face grow pale as I mentioned credit cards, house loans, and gambling debts. By the time I finished, Jennifer was staring at me with an expression that mixed horror with recognition. "My mother couldn't have known about any of this," she said slowly. "I haven't told anyone, not even my closest friends. Michael made me promise to keep our financial arrangements private until after the wedding. But if she somehow knew..." Jennifer spent the next hour making phone calls from my office to banks, credit card companies, her mortgage lender. Each conversation confirmed what Mrs. Kim had warned about. Credit cards opened in Jennifer's name without her knowledge. A second mortgage on her house that she'd never signed. Business accounts showing transfers to cover gambling losses that totaled more than $60,000. "She saved me," Jennifer whispered after hanging up from the final call. "If I'd married Michael on Saturday, if I'd signed those papers, making him co-owner of my house, I would have lost everything. But how did she know? She died before any of this came to light." Friday brought the final viewing, and Jennifer arrived early to spend private time with her mother before other mourners arrived. I watched from the hallway as she knelt beside the casket, speaking quietly about the discoveries she'd made, the wedding she'd canceled, the gratitude she felt for warnings that came from beyond death. As Jennifer spoke, I heard Mrs. Kim's voice one final time. "My daughter is safe now. A mother's work is never finished, even after death. Thank you for listening when she couldn't hear me herself." The funeral service Saturday proceeded beautifully, filled with tributes to Mrs. Kim's devotion to family and her protective nature. Jennifer spoke about her mother's wisdom, her ability to see through people's facades, her determination to shield her children from harm. She didn't mention the specific warnings that had saved her from financial ruin, but her gratitude for her mother's continued protection was evident in every word. After the burial, Jennifer thanked me for my role in preserving her mother's final messages. "I don't understand how any of this was possible," she said, "but I know my mother found a way to warn me, because that's who she was, someone who would never stop fighting to protect her family." I've since paid closer attention to the words of the deceased, understanding that sometimes the recently dead have urgent business with the living that transcends the normal boundaries of death. Love that strong doesn't end with a stopped heart. Sometimes it just needs new channels to express itself. Grace Kim's final words saved her daughter from a disastrous marriage and financial ruin. In the end, being a protective mother proved stronger than being dead. Some warnings are too important to let death interfere with their delivery.